But for hundreds of years, this sturdy little animal formed the basis of the economy of Scotland. He fed the bellies of England. And the hard wee men who drove the vast herds over hundreds of miles of wild, desolate country to the markets of the south have their own place in history. To understand the lore and the legends that grew up around the drovers and their beasts, you need a picture of places like Skye around about the beginning of the 16th century. Imagine these hillsides and all the islands beyond black with cattle. Literally black, because that was the colour of the original Kylos, the name given to the Highland cattle of the Hebrides. A couple of centuries before the West was won, all this was like Texas. The lairds were the great cattle barons, and the drovers the original cowboys. Protected by mountains and marshes from any rule of law, these were the Badlands, and rustling and cattle wars were rife. The next century saw vast droves from the Highlands and Islands, often as many as 100,000 head of cattle in one season, down to the lucrative markets, or trysts as they were called, at Crieff and Falkirk. Well, like many another thing, the railways and better roads finally killed off the drove. But now, one man wants to revive it in a very dramatic way, to try to find out exactly what it was like. John Kay is an author and adventurer who's written books about, among other places, India and the Himalayas. But the inspiration for his next book happened on his own doorstep near Oban, where he lives with his wife Julia and their 4 children.
Okay, hold on now.
Big one.
Obsessed by stories of old men whose fathers and grandfathers were drovers, he decided he would write about that most spectacular period of British history. The best way to do it, he concluded, was to have an authentic drove of his own.
And all the way to, like the old Isla cattle you were saying, was it? Or was it George you were saying it?
A herd of cattle was the first priority, and he raised the money to buy it with the help of sponsors he infected with his own enthusiasm.
You had no trouble with them?
He relied on the judgment of dealer Hughie MacDonald to choose the cattle. When John and his colleagues went to meet them on a hillside near Oban, they weren't disappointed.
Is that the whole lot?
Ah, there you go now, John. There you go. There you go. That's something to look at, isn't it?
That's fantastic.
They're in front of you. What do you think of them?
Amazing. That's a beautiful collection.
I think they've got a good cat.
What do you think, George?
You see this here? That must be the monarch of the glen there.
Come on. Come on. Yeah, he's a good boy. He's a good boy.
It was introduction time too for John's #1 drover, a shrewd stockman from Inverera in Argyll called George Knight. In a bid for authenticity, John and his drovers will be using sturdy Highland ponies on their 200-mile trek. These came by way of a family friend who runs a trekking centre. Julia Kay, who's been roped in for the trip, had to brush up on her riding.
Keep your rein a bit shorter. No, you're married. That's it.
Also, the ponies, who've only been ridden up till now, had to be introduced to the pack harness that was so familiar to their ancestors. In the most barren stretches of the drove, they'll be acting as 4-legged Land Rovers. In the old kitchen of their home, a former shooting lodge, the Kays and their helpers planned their route.
How possible is this track up here to Gorton? Can you get a vehicle up?
At one time you could get a Land Rover up there.
They'll be sticking to the old drove roads, over marshes, moors and rivers, and around mountains. One snag is that in many cases the ancient rights of way enjoyed by the early drovers no longer exist. John has had to negotiate with lairds and crofters for permission to cross their land.
Well, I wanted to talk to you about this.
But he's gathered together a resolute team of modern-day drovers.
But they'll be running into deer fences which run in straight lines drawn on maps right across bogs and burns and rocky crevasses, and it's really very difficult country for them. I think they'll panic and run the fence.
The day before the drove starts, and the well-laid plans take their first battering. The drovers gather on the far western tip of Skye to be greeted by force 11 gales and driving rain. The wind charges down the mountain with its head down, doing its best to rip their tents and lay waste their provisions. Lesser men would crawl under the canvas and take solace in the wares of the whisky firm who are sponsoring them. But John Kay is undaunted.
When you see the weather like this, are you having second thoughts about the advisability of it all?
No. In the old days, I mean, they slept out. The drovers, they wrapped themselves in their plaids and slept on the ground. We have tents. And when it was, if it was dry, they would very often put the plaids in the burn and make them wet and then wrap them round because they reckoned that gave them better insulation. And if it was very cold, they still put them in the burn and wrap them round them because then they froze on the outside and kept the wind out. So, I mean, these boys are really tough. I mean, we've actually got it very easy with tents and sleeping bags, so I don't think we have any cause to complain about all the rain.
Is anything going to stop you?
I hope not. No, I mean, there is a possibility of the swim from Skye to the mainland. We won't attempt that unless we're confident the cattle can handle it. And we may have to compromise where there's a long section of metalled road and we are worried about their feet becoming sore. If there is any concern, if the vet is worried about it, then we might have to slightly alter the route to avoid it. But otherwise, no, I don't think anything's going to stop us.
You'll be in Crieff on the appointed day.
Well, we hope to be increased to November the 5th. If it's the 6th or if it's the 4th, it doesn't really matter. I mean, the outstanding quality of the drover was his resourcefulness, and that, I hope, is what we bring to this exercise. OK, Chris. Come on.
What the way you get through here, John?
By the post.
Oh, that's all right.
At the appointed hour, and despite setbacks with the weather, the drove begins. It's taken months of planning to get 30 cattle, 7 drovers, 3 ponies and 3 dogs to set off together roughly in the same direction. But what they've embarked upon isn't just a 200-mile trek into the wilderness, it's also a 200-year step back into history. Among the hazards ahead are the treacherous waters of Kyle-Ree, the great wilderness of Rannoch Moor and the granite slopes of Ben Nevis. Over the next 4 or 5 weeks, they'll be crossing some of the most daunting land in the whole of Europe and some of the most beautiful. And we'll be with them. When we last saw the drove, it was heading off from Port Harcourt in the west of Skye, bathed in sunshine and looking good. But nobody was under any illusion that the trek across Skye, and thereafter across Scotland, was going to be easy. Odd as it may seem, for these modern-day drovers, it was likely to be more difficult than for their kilted counterparts of 200 or 300 years ago. And the drovers themselves, well, they're an unlikely mixture, to say the least. There's the leader, John Kay, an author and Himalayan adventurer, whose obsession to reenact an old drove and write a book about it has brought them all together. John's wife, Julia, who's along to lead and look after the pack ponies. George Knight, an experienced stockman from Argyll, and, on everybody's admission, the nearest thing to a real drover on the trek.
What's your boot?
As they came through the Coolin Mountains on evening 2 of the drove, wet and weary, they encountered their first setback. In a mountain bothy they'd been led to believe would be deserted, and where they'd planned to sleep for the night, they found unexpected company.
Well, we seemed to rather surprise you by arriving out of the mist.
What are you doing here?
Well, we're just going to stay the night and go over to Kilmarie on the way back to Broadford with all our beasts.
Beasts? What do you mean beasts?
Have you not seen the beasts?
Well, we've seen the odd one or two, yeah.
Well, there should be 30 Highland cattle that were driving right across Skye, right across the Highlands to Crieff.
13 mountain climbers from Tyneside, most of them policemen, a couple of German hikers, and a London lady looking for solitude had all beaten them to it. After a night spent in wet tents, undeterred, they press on. But there are other snags on the way. The humans, despite the cold and the wet, are in good shape. The cattle, however, have developed an ominous cough. Vet Chris Wiper, happy to accept any help available, does his stuff.
How long's he been bad, Chris?
Well, this one, unfortunately, got ill before the journey started.
Yes.
Last Sunday, in fact.
Yeah.
So we've been treating him during the course of the week. Took him out of the expedition so far and gave him a rest in this field where there's plenty of shelter. Yes. So this is his last examination. Should be the last injection. He might just jump a little bit if you can hold the gate fairly tight.
He can't go very far anyway, can he, unless he backs out towards you?
No,
Do you think the old drovers, hundreds of years ago, ever had to face things like this, or would they have recognised them if they'd seen them?
I would think that one like this, the old drovers would probably have lost on the way, you know, without the modern drugs that we've got nowadays. Probably have died on the way.
It's unlikely that the old drovers would have shown such concern for animal welfare. They were a wild bunch, whisky-swilling, wenching wee men who weren't averse to the odd spot of rustling when the opportunity arose. They came into their own in the Highlands and Islands when cattle droving proper started about the beginning of the 17th century. In those days, cattle were the main means of transportable wealth. Cattle wars and rustling were rife, not always in the dead of night. There's one story of a clan chief marching into his neighbour's glen to steal cattle in broad daylight, preceded by a piper. Such resourceful characters were the obvious choice when cattle droving in a more legal way started from the Highlands down to the lucrative markets in the south of Scotland and England itself. England depended on a ready and frequent supply of beef from Scotland. And throughout the summer, bands of drovers would visit the remote crofts, buying the cattle that would make up their droves. The haggling between the crofter and the drover often took place around a fireside like this one. The crofter was happy to do business because he couldn't readily turn his cattle into cash locally. But he was at a disadvantage because he had no way of knowing what prices the cattle were making in the markets of the south. And the drover normally gave him a little cash on the spot and a promissory note for the rest, payable when the cattle were sold at Crieff or Falkirk. But sometimes it was the drover who got his fingers burned, because after weeks of hardship driving the cattle across Scotland, he could end up selling them for less than he'd promised to pay the crofter for them. Now, if he was a genuine man, he'd honour his debts. But if he was a villain, and some of them were, then he was never seen in these parts again. During the drove itself, as the old drovers passed from hamlet to hamlet, the locals were never quite sure whether to lock up their cattle or their daughters first. But despite their occasional villainy, the travellers were held in high regard. They were a ready source of money to communities that had no experience of life beyond their own mountain passes. They were men that nature and lifestyle had fitted for a hazardous and difficult job. John Kay's modern drovers have the luxury of porridge and bacon and eggs under canvas. Their predecessors carried little sacks of oatmeal. For breakfast, they'd slash the rump of a live cow, drain off some of the blood, and mix it with the oatmeal to make a kind of primitive black pudding. Obviously, slashing one of the crofter's cows was preferable to disfiguring one of their own. One of the aims of Kay's drove is to find out as far as possible what life was like for the men pioneering the old drove routes, the relationships and tensions between them, as much as the hazards they faced. Daybreak the next day, and all is quiet at the drovers' camp. Too quiet. The cattle, which had been left grazing peacefully the previous night within a portable electric fence, had obviously got other ideas. While the drovers slept, they broke out and made their way back down the mountain. Now, where they ought to be is about 4 miles up the road that way, so it looks awfully as though in the middle of the night they've wandered off and actually come backwards along the track they took yesterday. Cattle actually droving themselves backwards is one of the perils that John Kay and his men obviously didn't anticipate. Now, at this very moment, I suspect they're combing the hills up there looking for them, so I'd better go and tell them where they are. But John and George had discovered the empty pen and were soon on the scene to retrieve their erratic charges.
Well, they've had a good bite along there anyway.
Oh. Look at that, fool's done.
Don't deserve any breakfast.
Eh?
I said, they don't deserve any breakfast.
No, no. She mean, John.
We get double, they don't get anything.
The truant beasts were soon rounded up and set on the right track again. There was no harm done, except for the repairable damage